Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of Candid Catholic Convos. I've talked about my journey with mental health a lot on this program, but in case you're new here, hi, I'm Rachel, a cradle Catholic, and I struggle with a mental illness. Throughout my life, I've battled anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and postpartum depression. I grew up thinking I was alone in my struggles. I didn't even know what I was going through had a name until I read it in a magazine. But as it turns out, over 20% of Americans experience some sort of mental illness every year, according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness. That's more than 50 million of us. I continue to bring it up because I remember how isolating it felt. And I'd hate to know that any of you were also feeling so alone when, in truth, 1 in 5 Americans struggle with a mental illness. Even Pope Francis had diagnosed anxiety. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and today I'm honored to welcome to the program Deacon Ed Shoener, who is a founding member of the Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers and the Catholic Institute of Mental Health Ministry at the University of San Diego. He serves on the Council on Mental Illness of the National Catholic Partnership on Disability and has authored several books on suicide. Along with his family and friends, Deacon Ed founded the Katie Foundation after his daughter Kathleen died by suicide in 2016. Her obituary went viral because it spoke to the needs and concerns of people who live with a mental illness. Deacon Ed, thank you so much for joining me on Candid Catholic Convos today. I'm really excited to talk to you about this. I feel like it's not talked about enough. I feel like we're getting to a place where it's more acceptable to talk about it, but it's still a source of isolation for a lot of people. So I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Well, thank you, Rachel. It is great to be here and talk about it and to try to break down the stigma associated with mental health and mental illness, both in the broader society and even within the church. And because Christ wants to be with us in the midst of these struggles, so it's good to talk about it. It's good to let the church do what it can to so we can support each other.
Absolutely. And I understand you're a bit of an authority on this subject. Would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself and kind of what led you to this ministry?
I'm authority in the sense that through the School of Hard Knocks, not so. I don't have an advanced degree or anything like that in mental health care or psychology or anything like that. Like many people, I've become a quote authority simply because of having lived with mental illness, both myself and within my family. My most intense, I guess you could say, experience with mental illness is with my daughter Katie, a beautiful young woman who died by suicide, sadly, in August of 2016 at the age of 29. She was a beautiful young girl. She had what's called bipolar disorder, bipolar type 1, which causes you to go both high on occasion into mania, and also the periods of deep, dark depression. In Katie's case, and it's different for everyone, but in Katie's case, her cycle would be periods of long periods of relatively stable behaviors, and occasionally she'd just very suddenly and abruptly become either manic or depressed. And she could be talking like you or I are talking with me, and then 5 minutes later, she fell off the table with depression. It was very unpredictable with Katie as to when these bouts would happen. Our first instance where we knew that Katie was dealing with this mood disorder called bipolar disorder was when she was a teenager in high school. My wife and I went away for a weekend, which is always a precarious thing to do when you got a bunch of teenagers in the house. But we thought we were at the point that we had to go away for a weekend for a business trip, and went away and got this call from our local hospital that Katie had attempted suicide. And so we came flying back to Scranton, of course, and tried to wrap our heads around what was going on. And as an aside, I always feel bad when I talk to people, hear the stories of someone who's lost a child to suicide on their first suicide attempt, and it comes right out of the blue with us, with Katie, and you have no idea what's going on or why that happened. Fortunately for us and for Katie, Katie's first attempt did not result in her death, and it took us quite a while, me in particular, to understand what was going on with this mental illness, what this bipolar disorder was. But gradually I came around, started to understand it, because like most people, you have no interaction with the mental health care system until it's right in your face and you have to deal with it. So it took me a while to learn what bipolar disorder is, and Katie always took it very seriously. She took her meds, she went to therapy, Uh, she was quite open with her friends about the mental illness and asking them to let us know if she started behaving oddly or different than she normally would. Uh, so she got treatment for about 10 years. She was in and out of the hospitals a couple times. Uh, but for the most part, she led a good life. She went to Penn State, got a graduate degree in business from Penn State, got a master's degree from Ohio State, and an MBA, and she was one of those exuberant personalities that had tons of friends. And she wasn't the stereotype of what people think of, which is an incorrect stereotype. But so often people think of someone with mental illness as sort of like talking to themselves and being failures and not being able to do anything. And, for most people with mental illnesses, that's not the case. Most people with mental illnesses can live reasonably good lives and have to learn how to manage the illness. And Katie, if you met Katie, you would have never known she had a mental illness. You would have never known she had bipolar disorder. But sadly, on August 3rd, 2016, and I'm sure that was very impulsive. She had one of those moments where her depression just took her over the cliff, and she died by suicide. And it was sad, but I will say this: like any other parents who live with a child or a spouse, I guess, if you're not a parent, or someone you love that has a mental illness, this is always in the back of your mind that it could end in suicide. So the day that Katie died, of course, we didn't know it was going to be that day, but the fact that she died by suicide was not a complete surprise to us. So we miss her dearly. And when she died, I thought, full on dad mode kicked in, and you try to do what you can to still take care of your little girl as best you can. So I wrote this simple obituary that said exactly what happened, because I didn't want any gossiping or discussion, what happened to the deacon's daughter here in Scranton. So I simply wrote this very simple obituary that said Katie had a mental illness. She died by suicide, but that's not who she is. I mean, she's not defined by that. She's much more than her mental illness and her manner of death, and that we need to overcome the stigma and discrimination that's associated with mental illness, and we need to do better. We need to find better ways to treat and manage these illnesses. So much to my amazement, because neither Katie or I are celebrities, this obituary went viral all over the world. We heard from thousands, tens of thousands of people saying that that's true, that all too often people with mental illnesses are seen only as their illness. They're not seen as the beautiful creation of God that they are, with multifaceted personalities and issues and desires like everybody. But they get boxed into just, they're a schizophrenic, or they're bipolar or something like that. They don't see beyond that. And so I heard from so many people saying that resonates with them, their experience, and that we need to do better, and particularly within the church, need to open up the doors of the church and welcome not those people, us. It's all of us. It's not like it's just some sort of small segment of poor souls that have these illnesses. We all deal with these illnesses to one extent or another. And if we're not dealing with it directly ourselves, we know and love someone that is. So we've started this ministry, Association of Catholic Mental Health Ministers, to try to minister in a more deliberate way to people who live with mental illnesses. So that's my story, how I got to this point. I joke it was God's way of hitting a hard-headed guy from Scranton over the head with a 2x4 to get involved with others in this type of ministry and bringing it into the life of the church.
Well, first, let me say that I'm very sorry for your loss. Katie continues to make an impact even now. And I remember reading that obituary. I was in the throes of my own mental health journey. I had just had a baby and was like really, really struggling with postpartum depression. And I remember reading that.
If I could just interrupt you there for a minute, Rachel. Many people don't think that's real, the postpartum depression. They don't see that as a real mental health challenge. And I'm sure you know, and I have since come to know, it's a very real experience for so many women. And it's not just that you're, an overly emotional woman. It's a real illness. And fortunately, the treatment for it's better now. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because people need to realize postpartum depression is a serious illness that needs to be managed.
Absolutely. And like you, I learned a lot about it through the School of Hard Knocks, because I did have to do a lot of my own advocacy, because at the time it was talked about, but there weren't a whole lot of things we could do. And it was something that I needed to kind of push forward on. And then when you're in the middle of it as well, it feels like you're just walking,
Right.
like just waiting for
Right.
that light at the end of the tunnel. But I like that
Right.
you
Right.
mentioned that this isn't just for those people. Like we shouldn't classify those with a mental illness as other, because I had read a statistic that 48% of adults will have experienced mental health illness at some point in their life. And if
Sure.
they haven't dealt with it personally, then they know someone who has, which is
Absolutely.
astonishing.
Right. Yeah, it's absolutely, people find it astonishing, but in one sense, it makes perfect sense. We all deal with physical illnesses, and these mental illnesses do have for the most part, have some sort of biological, biochemical component to them, neurological component. And sure, we live in a continuum of mental health. It's not like there's a hard line where, okay, you're mentally healthy with no illness, and on the other line, you have an illness. It's a continuum. And many of us live with anxiety and depression, which is like the common cold of mental illness, to the more severe illnesses like severe schizophrenia and other illnesses with psychosis that are very ill. But it's a continuum. And, none of us, no family gets off scot free in this. And it's unfortunate that there's this stigma and discrimination and misunderstanding that exists. But I'm absolutely convinced that it's something we can talk about now, that there's a crack in the door. Maybe the door hasn't thrown completely wide open, but there's a crack in the door now where we can talk about this. And I'm absolutely convinced the Holy Spirit is sort of taking that little crack in the door and blowing through it and bringing this into the life of the church so we can understand and support each other, because Christ wants to be with us in this. Christ is the greatest psychologist ever. It's not like there's anything new with mental illness. Mental illness has been around, and mental health challenges been around certainly since the days of Christ and well before. And Christ understands our struggles with this and wants to be with us. And one of the primary ways Christ accompanies us is through his church, through you and I, as broken human beings as we can be. I'm presuming you're broken in your own way. I certainly am. And but God can work through us to support each other.
Yes, and speaking of support, you know, going back to my own mental health journey for a second, there were a lot of well-intentioned people in my life who, you know, would maybe say things that weren't inherently bad, but also weren't helpful. And one of the ones that stung the most was like, "Oh, you're not praying enough," or you're
Oh,
surrounded by
yeah.
blessings. You know, what do you really have to be sad about? Like when I had my baby, it was, you have this beautiful little baby and he's a great eat. What do you have to be upset about right now? Which in turn started this
Right.
cycle of, you know, feeling guilty and then not being able to work through it on my own, or wanting to seek out help because I felt like I was a failure. How is your ministry working to kind of shift that narrative?
Yeah, we talk about it all the time, and I'm sorry you went through that, Rachel. That is a hard experience, and Katie went through that to a certain extent, and we've even gone through it as parents, particularly my wife. It strikes hard because she feels guilty, even though rationally she knows it's not true, emotionally. And I find this true for many women that they have this notion that, well, you weren't a good mother if your child had a mental illness, if your child died by suicide. Even though, like I said, rationally she knows that's not the case, but there's still that emotional response. And at best, people say things that are not helpful, if not downright harmful. But yeah, we try to do what we can to dispel that stigma and misunderstanding about these mental health. I wish that were true. That if you prayed more, the depression went away, or that we had some sort of special deliverance prayer or exorcism that would make these mental illnesses go away. In fact, it's not uncommon for parents, when they find out their child has a severe illness like schizophrenia or some sort of psychotic disorder, to call the chancery and ask if an exorcist can come out and make it go away. It doesn't work that way. It would be wonderful if it would. So what I can say is that Christ accompanies us in that suffering and in those struggles, just like he does when we have cancer or heart disease or any other illness. He accompanies it with us. And maybe occasionally there's a miracle, but a miracle is, by very definition, extremely rare. So Christ can accompany with us in that suffering, and so often the way Christ accompanies us is through other people within his church. So the more that we can understand these illnesses, not shame people, pray with us that struggle with these illnesses, and pray for us, but don't make it sound like we have this illness because we're not praying enough. God knows, I, prayed when Katie died and throughout her struggle with mental illness. Myself, Rachel, I deal with depression. And we can get into that. For far too many years, I self-stigmatized myself. I did not want to acknowledge I had depression and didn't get it taken care of because I thought, well, I'm a deacon. I can pray my way out of this. It doesn't work that way. So a big part of this is, like you said, is just educating people, maybe talking about our own experiences with these illnesses to break down the stigma and let the light of Christ shine into our lives with greater understanding and support.
I love that you mentioned feeling like because of your situation in life that you had all of the tools and you weren't ready to accept help from an outside source right away, but that you eventually found yourself needing that additional help. I'm the same way, for especially with the postpartum depression. I had had bouts of anxiety and depression like most of my life up until like I actually had a name for it. And then, so I knew that postpartum depression was like going to be coming at some point as soon as like when I had a family. So I thought I was ready for it. I thought I could handle it. And when people would say like, you're not praying enough, I'm like, that's all I'm doing right now because I'm so terrified of this coming. But going back to what you said about not being ready to accept help, I feel like when we're physically ill or we're physically injured, it's a lot easier for us to go see a doctor. Like that makes sense. And it would make sense that you would also need a professional to take care of your mental and spiritual health as well. But why is it sometimes so much harder to get to a psychologist or a psychiatrist? Why do we sometimes struggle with that?
Well, I think it's what the term is used, self-stigmatization. We don't want to admit to ourselves that we have a mental illness because, we swim the same cultural waters that everyone else swims in. So there's this stigma with mental illness. We don't understand what other people are dealing with, and we don't want to admit to ourselves that we have an illness. So for many years, I'll just talk about my particular story. For many years, I struggled with depression and didn't want to acknowledge that I had depression. And who paid the most for that other than me was my wife. Because depression, mental illness doesn't affect just the person. And my wife had to put up with me being not only, not wanting to get up and do things around the house or lay around and be, lazy, as it's sometimes called, but also the flip side of depression is anger. You can get pretty grumpy and pretty miserable. The one comedian jokes about depression being anger without enthusiasm. So you can unenthusiastic anger. But I could be pretty tough to live with when I was going through these bouts of depression. And the other thing is it would come in like the fog. I had no control over when it came in. Sort of like the flu, it would come in and then it'd go away, and no apparent reason why it came in, no apparent reason why it'd go away. And that's how you know it's an illness. It wasn't triggered by anything in particular, at least that I could identify. But so eventually, through my experience with Katie and dealing with so many other people with mental illness, I finally went to a doctor and said, I have this depression, I have these serious bouts of sadness and thoughts of death, maybe not actively suicidal, but certainly wishing I would, it'd be okay with me if God took me tonight, that sort of thing. So I got a little pill. I wouldn't necessarily call it a happy pill, but it certainly takes the edge off it. And I go around talking at conferences and that, and I'll talk about my experience with depression and self-stigmatization. And inevitably, at least for me, I usually have quite a few men, although occasionally women, come up to me afterwards and say that they have the same sort of thoughts and the same sort of things, and they've never talked to anybody about it, maybe not even their spouse, because they're afraid they would scare their spouse talking about suicide or death like that. And I always try to encourage them to go see a doctor. It's not bad to see a doctor if you're struggling with these. And I tell people, and if any of your listeners remember nothing from this conversation except this, I hope they remember this, is that if you're experiencing suicidal thoughts, more than just a passing thought, but, really thoughts of death and wishing maybe killing yourself, that sort of thing, take that as a sign of, like, if you were having chest pains or it's tingling down your elbow, down your arms, you'd go to the doctor and say, what's going on? I got these pains, I got this tingling, or I'm thinking of suicide, I'm thinking of death. What's going on? Can you help me? And try to analyze that. And maybe nothing, it may be just be a passing thought or something like that. But it might be something more serious. and to get it taken care of. And there's no shame in going to see your GP and perhaps getting referred to a psychiatrist, a specialist, to get it taken care of. So again, if any of your listeners out there have these thoughts of suicide, and it's much more common than most people realize, it's very relatively common thoughts. Go see a doctor. You wouldn't hesitate to see a doctor if you had some physical symptoms of an illness, and definitely none of us are made to kill ourselves. God, did not make us to die by suicide, and it goes against every instinct that we have to die by suicide. So go see a doctor and try to get it, managed, and live in recovery, as they say, and try to manage these things. Unfortunately, the word cure is not there yet for mental illness. That's not a word you hear very often. Postpartum depression is a little different because it revolves around hormones and that sort of thing after a pregnancy. But for most of these mental illnesses, it's something you learn to live with, you learn to manage. I love the word Pope Francis uses. Pope Francis lives with anxiety, and he talks about this quite a bit over the years, his anxiety. And he uses the word, you have to, it's such a Pope Francis phrase, you learn to caress your mental illness. In America, we would say manage it. We have a more technical way of looking at it. He says you learn to caress it. You learn to take care of it. You learn to live with it. It's not going away. So what he talks about his anxiety that manifested itself first way back in the 1970s when he was a Jesuit provincial, as they call it, in Argentina under a dictatorship. And his priests that he was in charge of were, undergoing terrible abuse and kidnapping, all sorts of stuff. And he had anxiety over how to take care of them. So he went to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist at the time in the 70s. And he says he met with her for quite a few months. She gave him a number of good techniques and ways to deal with his anxiety that he still uses to this day. So he's quite willing to talk about his anxiety, how he manages it. He recognizes when it's coming on, and that's not a good time to make decisions. If he sees the anxiety, he'll sort of put a major decisions off to the side until he's feeling better and his anxiety's under control. So even the Pope deals with this, and it's good to see that the Pope is willing to talk about his anxiety. It's something that all these illnesses, like any other physical illness, it's important that we accept the fact that we have these illnesses, learn ways to recognize when it's coming on, and have tools available to manage them or caress them, as Pope Francis would put it.
I think that's very validating to hear that, even someone as close to God as the Pope struggles with this. And I love that word caress, because my therapist used to say, it's like, he's like, you got to ride that wave. Right. Sometimes you're going to have highs, sometimes you're going to have lows. Sometimes the sea is calm. Sometimes It's a bit stormy. It's just about being able to ride that wave. And I love that you mentioned that depression isn't always sitting down and crying uncontrollably. Sometimes it's rage. Mine used to show up in the form of rage or being completely unable to do anything. So there's lots of, there's no one size fits all for depression. So if somebody out there listening is concerned that, maybe they're crying too much, or maybe they have no idea where this rage is coming from, that's that tingling down the arm of it's time to go see someone.
And that we can recognize it. And I will say this from the point of view of a man. I like to think I'm, macho in my own way. Many men like to look at that, or machismo if you're Latino. But you can still be your manliness is not diminished by the fact that you have a mental illness.
Absolutely.
That men need to recognize it's okay to go see a doctor. It's not that you're weak, or that you're not able to take care of your family or do your job. If anything, it's a sign of strength that you have enough self-confidence that you can go see a mental health care practitioner and take care of your illness. It doesn't make you less of a man because you're doing it. If anything, it makes you more of a man because you're willing to face up to your challenges and take care of them.
Absolutely, I think that's very important to talk about, and especially as men, or even just as members of society. I feel like in the last several decades, we've really attached a sense of worthiness to our productivity, whether, when we think we're only as good as the work we produced, and vice versa, which can sometimes mean that are struggling with mental health issues or overwhelming emotions like just grief. Um, Consequently, we end up not performing our best, which then sends us into that spiral of I'm not good enough. I can't seem to handle it. What's wrong with me? What should we do when we find ourselves in a situation like that of being consumed by our productivity?
Yeah, we live in a tough culture, don't we, Rachel? I mean, it is a tough culture where we are defined by our productivity or our fame or our image of some a self-constructed image or an image constructed by society. We all made in the image and likeness of God. I know that can sound pretty cliche at times, but it's certainly true. And we need to remember that we're loved and adored by Christ. And in the midst of these illnesses, it's hard to see that. It's hard to see that we are loved and adored by Christ. Uh, but I think those are the two things that we need to keep in mind, that we are more than what we produce. But nevertheless, there are tremendous pressures, and I get this, on men and women to produce, because we want lots of things. We want a nice home. We want nice cars. We want our kids to go to good colleges. All of that sort of stuff. So there is tremendous pressure on us to produce, and I don't want to diminish that or make it sound like that's not a real issue. A large part of this, I think, I mean, that's a difficult question, because I don't want to trivialize that issue. But large part of this is taking it to God, I think. Find this type of support that you can find in your community, and realize there is support out there for you. And if you need to avail yourself of that support, go get it. In the most difficult circumstances, sometimes you have to avail yourself of disability. Because just like you can be disabled with a physical illness, and you can get support, fortunately in this country, through the government, through disability payments, you can also get support for mental health problems when you're disabled by mental illnesses. And there's no shame in going and asking for disability support when you have a serious mental illness. In fact, the disability support for mental illness is one of the largest categories of disability payments in the country. So that's when it's real severe. But the other extent would be and I think this is where the church can play a big role. If you're not to the point where you're disabled because of your mental illness, but like you said in your question, you're questioning your self-worth, I think that's where the church can play a tremendous role in helping people see their worthiness. And when I say the church, I mean, it's not just going talking to a priest or a deacon or a bishop, but I mean the church being each other. So in a lot of our mental health ministries, one of the things we do is provide spiritual support groups for each other, for people that live with these illnesses, where we can come and talk about our mental health challenges and where our faith is and what does that mean for us. And also spiritual support groups for the parents and caregivers, because so often when a child or a loved one comes down with a mental illness, you feel all alone. So you can go talk to each other about this and talk about what the resources are in the community, and openly talk about how this is affecting your faith. So I think a lot of this goes to just being able to talk about it and be open about it, and reach out for support, and to realize that you're not alone, you're not defined by your illness, and you can lead a good life even with the presence of these illnesses in your life.
What about for those of us who struggle to advocate for our mental health or our spiritual health because we feel like we can't afford to slow down? Like maybe we have a demanding job, or maybe we're in a financial situation where we don't have insurance, or we're just strained financially. I mean, mental health services unfortunately cost either time or money.
One thing is to be aware of your rights under the Americans with Disability Act. You cannot be fired because you have a mental illness. And,
Mm.
and I know people worry, I've talked to people, they worry about disclosing the illness to their employer. But, if you were in a physical illness, physical disability, you have no trouble telling your employer, I have this physical illness, maybe in some cases I now have to use a wheelchair, or I can't fit, and they have to provide reasonable accommodation under the law. The same goes with mental illness. They have to provide a reasonable accommodation under the law if you have a mental illness, a depression, or whatever. So that would be the one thing is that don't be afraid to tell your employer, because they have an obligation under, at least under the U.S. law, to not discriminate against you because you have a mental illness. So I would always keep that in mind, that you can ask your employers for these accommodations. And again, the other thing is, like we were talking earlier, just being self-aware of it and trying to manage it, and be aware when the depression or anxiety or whatever it is coming on, and you're in a better position to manage it or caress it, as Pope Francis would say. But just be aware of it. Just like, if you have the flu, you have no trouble calling into your employer, saying, I have the flu, I need to take a couple of days off. There's no problem calling your employer and saying, listen, my anxiety's through the roof. I'm going to take a couple of days off. I need to leave early. We need to get past this. And I would say even employers need to get past this and to recognize that this is a medical condition that your employees need to be cared for and taken care of, and don't discriminate against them because they have a mental health condition. And employers deal with their own mental health conditions too, by the way. Yeah, I used to be a boss. I owned business, and yeah, it's not like the employers get a pass in this either. So I think a lot of this is just simply being openly talking about it and being willing to talk about it, and being your own advocate. Some large part of it is just kind of getting the strength and willingness to talk about it. Say, I have these illnesses, and be a little firm. Say, listen, you can't discriminate against me because I have depression or anxiety or whatever. You can't do that. That's against the law. And to have that sort of confidence to be able to do that and assert yourself. That might just be my personality, but I think being able to assert your rights under this, and not only rights as a citizen of the country, but just as a human being. This is a condition we all live with, and we should be able to insist that we be understood and treated properly.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I guess I'm with the rest of the population in that I always just assumed that the Disabilities Act meant a physical
Right.
disability, not necessarily a mental illness disability. But that makes so much sense, and especially with employers being open to the idea that if we want to continue to produce good work, then we need healthy employees to do so. So giving them that little bit of extra time is going to push you forward in the future. It's that a short-term setback for a long-term
Right. And I
goal.
think it's important under that act is to let your employer know that you have this disability.
Absolutely.
Don't let them off the hook, so to speak. You got to tell them. Some people are reluctant to tell the employer that I have this disability, and for good reason. I mean, the stigma of discrimination's out there. But nevertheless, if it is starting to affect your day-to-day work life, you've got to let your employer know this. It sort of puts them on notice that they have to help you with this, and provide some reasonable accommodations. Obviously, they can't. The word reasonable is in there, so you
Hmm.
come in and say, "I need the next year off." That's not reasonable, but you can work with them to find some accommodations.
Yes. The key is communication,
Right, right,
opening that door.
right.
I want to talk about some other invisible wounds because I know mental illness is often very, very invisible. Trauma and grief are also invisible wounds. And just like physical wounds, they require time for healing and reflection. But as human beings today, as a society, we have this sort of unspoken reverence for those who can keep their personal turmoil and their work life or work productivity separate. And it says a lot about how we process trauma, which is we try to control it with work or exercise or diet or any other numerous healthy or unhealthy distractions. How do we work to let go of that control so that God can do his best work in healing us?
Yeah. Well, I wish I had a simple answer to that. It's a complicated answer. I mean, trauma. Well, we're all affected by trauma more than we realize. I think one of the more common traumas is family traumas, particularly if you have parents or loved ones that close to you that deal with substance abuse or alcoholism. Anybody that's grew up in a household with alcoholism in the family, whether it's the mother or the father, or sometimes both, you're traumatized by that, and it's something that you have to live with your entire life. It doesn't like depression and anxiety. These traumas don't go away completely, but to be able to recognize you have these traumas and to be able to maybe see a therapist or a counselor to help you manage the effects of the trauma is an important part of this. It's just, I think, half the battle, maybe more than half the battle, is acknowledging that you have this trauma-related challenge. I mean, so often people who are brought up with alcoholic parents is they have this issue of anxiety and wanting some control because as kids they never knew what they were going to be walking into when they came home from school every day. and that's traumatic, not having that sort of sense of stability or certainty that you had a family life that was there. So trying to live with, trying to recognize that you have that is not your fault, and you have this anxiety, and you have to be able to manage and live with it as part of it. There's all sorts of other traumas. Fortunately, in the U.S., we don't have a whole lot of trauma related to war, but we do have quite a few immigrants that have been traumatized by war. We have to keep in mind our brothers and sisters who have come through the refugee and immigration system, even through Central and South America. Can you imagine, Rachel? You and I never had to deal with this, but the trauma of traipsing for hundreds, if not thousands, of miles with your family, through countries that you're not familiar with, and then crossing a border that way, and then being not only simply not accepted, but actively rejected and looked down upon and discriminated against, the trauma that goes with that, it's just horrendous. It's just horrendous. And trying to recognize that this is a real illness, and it's a real wound. It's, you can have physical wounds, but these psychological wounds are very real. And oftentimes we unknowingly inflict people with these psychological wounds just because of our own cultural discriminations or cultural misunderstandings. We all need to love each other and accept each other, and to try to do as best we can to heal these wounds. But these wounds of trauma, just like Christ's wounds on the day of his the resurrection when he appeared before Thomas, his wounds were still there. They were healed, but they don't go away. And a lot of times our woundedness can be a way to show support for other people that are struggling with doubts and wondering if people are with them, is to be able to express and display our own wounds and accompany people.
Yes, that's very, very powerful. A very powerful reminder that even Jesus still had the scars from his wounds. That it's not something we ever truly get over, but we can learn to caress and work through.
And God can turn these things to the good. From Romans, God can turn it to the good. Just like Christ's crucifixion, his wounds didn't go away, but he was able to use his wounds to help Thomas come to the faith and realize that that he's with them, that he's a real person. Christ is very much a real person. He's not some sort of legend in the sky, but he understands our woundedness. And even though he was crucified on the cross, he turned his wounds to the good. And that's part of what mental health ministry is about for all of us. Many of us in this ministry are wounded in some way, and that we can turn our wounds to the good to help each other. And Christ is, of course, the greatest example of that.
You mentioned earlier, speaking of helping one another, you mentioned earlier about family members or those who care about somebody who may be working through a mental illness. How can those of us who are supporting someone else, whether we are struggling with our own mental illness or we're not, but we love somebody who is, how can we be present for someone who is struggling? How do we love them better?
Well, you can probably relate to this, Rachel, from when you're in your midst of your postpartum depression. I can relate this in my depression. My wife, doesn't really struggle with depression and anxiety, so it's sometimes hard for her to understand what to do when I'm in the midst of my depression. I'm guessing your loved ones may have the same struggle when you're dealing with depression, and there is nothing they can do to make it go away. I wish there was. I mean, just like
you want so badly just to be able to push a button and make it stop, and it doesn't work that way.
Right, they want to fix it.
Yes,
and it doesn't work that way. So a lot of it is just accompaniment and understanding. I know that sounds simple, but it's so important to just have someone sit there with you quietly. I'll get emotional talking about this. Just sit there quietly, be with you in your pain, because there's nothing you can do to make the pain go away. We all want to fix things. It's interesting. Pope Francis, who I greatly admire and has deep insights into the human condition, he did every month the Pope has a prayer intention. So this is how I first got to interact with the Vatican and the Pope's prayer network. He was doing a prayer intention on depression, which was the first time the Pope, this is November of 2021, first time Pope monthly prayer intention was around a mental health condition. And one of the things he said about this topic in his little reflection on depression, he goes, sometimes there just are no answers. We just have to accept that and to sit with someone when there's no answers. That sit in the silence, and silence can be so powerful if you just sit with someone in the silence. So I think that's a large part of what we can do is just accept the mental illness, accept the person who's struggling with these challenges, and sit in silence with them and just let them know you love them, and to say that it's good. It's good that you exist. Because so many times with these illnesses, we wonder, is it good that we exist? And it not only disrupts our relationship with each other as human beings, but it disrupts our relationship with God. We sometimes think God doesn't love us, that we're not worthy of God's love. That there's all sorts of distorted understanding of our relationship with God. All of that, of course, is not true, but that is what the illness says to us. And I would not be so quick to say that that's the devil. I would say, other than the extent that all illness is rooted in evil, but that is what the illness is telling us. Is that that's what depression and anxiety is all about. Is that it creates distorted thinking, distorted perceptions of reality, and just if you're around someone that's struggling with that, just help bring them back to reality as best you can. This is that you're loved and it's good that you exist, and in the hopes that this whatever we're going through, the experience will pass. And usually it does pass. Sometimes in a couple hours, sometimes a couple of days, sometimes you need a couple of weeks, but it will pass at some point. So yeah, I wish there was a little fix-it button that I had, but it's more complicated than that. And but God gives us the strength to accompany each other.
I love that. That's beautiful. Just sitting in the silence. And my husband and I have developed over the last several years of, if one of us is having a bad day or we're having because we both experience our own mental health issues. My husband served overseas, so he has his own.
Was he in a war zone?
He was in Iraq. He has his own struggles as well. Sure. And one of the things that we tell each other is, do you want me to hear you or do you want me to help you?
Oh,
and that just helps us like so much of like this. Hey, this isn't something you can fix right now, but can you just listen to me? Because if I can get it off my chest, I will feel a little bit better. And that just, again, going back to communication, that little line of here's where I'm at right now. Can we work together? Right. Can we do the tough stuff together?
Right. And sometimes it's, I even say this, my wife and that, sometimes hear you, help you. Sometimes it's not even that. Sometimes it's just sit with me and hold me, or just sit with me. You don't even want to have a physical, you don't want to hug or anything. You just need someone to sit with you, so you don't feel alone. But you don't want to do a whole lot of talking. You don't want to do a whole lot of explaining. Just sit with you. It's sort of like prayer. It's sort of like sitting in the presence of God, and that sort of simple type of contemplative prayer, where you just sit there with a loved one and just know that you're not alone.
And kind of building off of that, I feel like sometimes in addition to whatever we're dealing with mentally, there's also a level of stress that we may have put on ourselves to be a good Catholic Christian, like attending daily mass or going to holy hour or saying the liturgy or the hours, or like we were saying earlier, it's not inherently bad, but suggesting that I'm not praying enough or that I'm not praying the right way. Like we kind of just build that onto whatever we're already dealing with. And then feeling like we're not worthy of God's love. How do we marry our faith and our wellness to see ourselves the way God sees us?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, I guess. But I would say this, coming down to a little more of the specifics of what you raised about praying and getting to Mass and all the rest of that. I run into that occasionally. Sometimes people with social anxiety disorders truly cannot go to Mass. They cannot be around that many people. And to understand that, and I think many priests understand that, whether it's a sin or not. If someone had cancer and was undergoing chemotherapy, no one would expect them to get to Sunday Mass. And the same thing with some of these serious illnesses, mental illnesses, that sometimes you just can't be around people. I mean, you just can't. And that's okay. And I would question whether or not that was certainly certainly not going to mass. I guess it's a great matter, but certainly the culpability or responsibility of it when you can't get there because of these illnesses, including mental illnesses, is diminishes the culpability of it. So to recognize that, maybe at times you just can't go to mass, and that's okay, or you can't pray in the way that you want to, and that's okay. And the other thing that comes up quite a lot, and it's been around for centuries, even St. Ignatius talked about it in his when he was starting his ministry, is that obsessive compulsive disorder is a
Mm.
serious issue, particularly within Catholicity, within the Catholic world. That I'm not taking the Eucharist in the right way, or whatever. You can get obsessed over certain things, or that God hasn't forgiven me. Even though intellectually, you go to confession and intellectually you've been forgiven of your sins, you still obsess over whatever sin, maybe even relatively minor sins. And I've had more than one priest ask me about that, and because it's an unusual that the person keeps coming back every week, confessing the same sin week after week after week, even though they've been absolved. And that's the mental illness talking. It's not that they dealt the love or charity of God or the graces of the sacrament. It's the illness. They can't just accept it that they've been forgiven, and to recognize and don't view them as bad Catholics. It's if they're carrying this tremendous burden with them of this illness, and to recognize that, and it's no impediment to holiness. I write about this quite a bit. For example, Saint Oscar Romero. Um, from the 1970s. I think he died in the early 80s. He was a martyr in El Salvador. He had a modern psychiatric disorder of obsessive compulsive disorder, and he's still a saint. His Blessed Rulio Grande, a Jesuit from El Salvador in the 70s, he had a modern psychiatric diagnosis of schizophrenia. He's blessed, and is certainly recognized by the Church, living a life of great holiness. And many other saints live with mental illnesses and mental health challenges. So it's no impediment to holiness. God can certainly overcome anything, and can certainly overcome mental illness and lead people to lives of holiness. So I think we're gradually starting to see that in even the lives of saints. That some people at times, I remember when I was writing an article one time and someone said to me, "Oh, you can't say a saint had mental illness. You're saying the saints are crazy." And no, it's not that they're crazy. It's that they're human beings like all the rest of us. And that the saints learned how to live with their mental illnesses, mental health challenges, and God didn't, God can overcome all of that, and they live lives of great holiness. So people with mental illnesses have much to offer the church. Much, and many of them have been saints, and many more are going to become saints because of their ability to provide that example to the church and the people that they can overcome and these challenges and live lives of great, great holiness. And they have much to offer because they understand suffering, they understand the need for dependence on God, they have a great humility, they have great empathy. So it's not just us ministering to those people with mental illness; it's people with mental illness ministering to us and ministering to the church, bringing these great virtues into the life of the church.
I love that. It reminds me of um, something that Sister Geraldine, who's a frequent guest on the podcast, always says. She said, we're all called to be saints. Some are with a capital S, and
Yeah,
some are with
right,
a lowercase s.
right.
And even if we don't become a capital S, like we still are making an impact. And I think that for people struggling with mental illness, they feel like their life is of no consequence. And in fact, it is, because you don't actually realize how far and wide your existence, goes,
Right.
how many people it affects. And kind of piggybacking off of that, and then also going back to what you said about your wife experiencing, some guilt associated with mental illness in her family. It's no secret that we have a huge, long lasting impact on our kids, whether it's great memories, or whether it's traumatic memories, or just any interaction we have with our children. And it may be, maybe this is irrational, but one of my biggest fears is that my children will inherit my anxiety and depression, because they've seen me struggle in handling it. Like sometimes I handle it really great, and other times not so great. How can we be open and honest with our children, but also aware of when when they might be struggling, and recognizing when it may be time to get them help. And having walked through this firsthand, what would you recommend?
Well, I mean, sure, our kids are going to experience and inherit some of our mental health challenges and mental illnesses. If you have a family with diabetes, it's more than likely your kids, one or more of your kids are going to have diabetes or heart disease or pick your physical illness. Of course, they're going to experience mental health challenges. I know in our family, with the Katie had bipolar disorder, and now that we're looking at the family tree, there are probably more than a couple suicides in our family tree going back some generations. And so these things run in families, and to let our kids know that maybe you are at a higher risk of depression or anxiety because mom experienced it, or grandma experienced it, or great grandma died by suicide. Because back in those days this stuff was really kept silent and we didn't talk about it. At least we're starting to talk about it a little bit more. But yeah, to be open and be able to talk to your kids about these illnesses and these challenges, so destigmatize it with our kids, so that when our kids see these things coming on, they recognize it and will get the help they need. I think that's the biggest thing we can give to our kids, not to try to pretend it doesn't happen or we don't have these experiences, but to let them know that it's part of life and they very well might have it. We still love them very much, of course, and try to bring down the stigma and discrimination. So that I think the greatest gift we can give to our kids is to recognize that mental illness and mental health challenges are not character flaws or moral failings. They're something we need to recognize and deal with and manage or caress, as Pope Francis says. And I think that's the biggest gift we can give to them, is just, get rid of the stigma, just openly talk about these things, and like we would any sort of physical illness, and let them find that type of support.
Absolutely. It's generational.
It's
It's
generational, and I'll tell you, one thing. Our chaplain for our organization is Bishop John Dolan. He's the Bishop of Phoenix now, and when you think you have it bad, and losing a child to suicide, believe me, is terrible. But he's lost 3 siblings to suicide, plus a brother-in-law to suicide, and in fact, his sister Mary died by suicide not too long after he was ordained the Bishop of Phoenix, just a year or two ago. So it goes to show you, it runs in families, and it doesn't discriminate whether you're a bishop or a deacon or, some sort of just marginal Catholic. I mean, we're all affected by this sort of thing, and it doesn't make any difference. And there does seem to be family components to this. There seems to be some sort of genetic, the science of all of mental illness hasn't been figured out or at the point where we are with a lot of these physical illnesses, but clearly there seems to be some sort of genetic family component to some of these illnesses. It doesn't, explain the whole thing, but there's certainly a component of that. So yeah, I always use Bishop Dolan's sad, difficult story as an example that runs in families, and even a high-ranking church official doesn't get a pass in this.
right. So for those listening who maybe are ready to take that next step in getting support, through building a community at church, or just looking for that support, where can they go to learn more about this organization?
Well, of course, go to our webpage. We try to communicate extensively through our webpage now. So it's Catholic MHM, Catholic Mental Health Ministries, CatholicMHM.org. We have a lot of resources there. We have online training programs now. If you're interested in starting a mental health ministry in your parish, we have a lot of online programs to give you the confidence. You don't need to be a mental health professional, but maybe you need a little nudge to have the confidence to offer this ministry. And I always say, you can offer this ministry if you have 2 things. You have the basic qualities to offer this ministry. One is a deep love of Christ, and 2 is a deep desire to support or help people with these mental health challenges. If you've got those 2 things, you can start a mental health ministry and be a good mental health minister in your parish. Beyond that, we will offer some training courses on how to start a ministry and maybe how to start a support group. And our courses are aimed at adult learners, so they're not academically rigorous. They're aimed at adults, to how to sort of basically kind of teach yourself in a sense how to do this and give you the confidence to do it. We have all sorts of prayers and other resources there. So certainly go to our webpage and go to the Pope's Prayer Network. The second Monday of every month is Mental Health Day on the Pope's Prayer Network. So whatever the Pope's praying about, we take a mental health angle on it. So, for example, last month, the Pope was praying for martyrs, and so we talked about martyrs who struggle with mental illnesses, still led lives of holiness. Or when he's praying for teachers, we talk about the mental health needs of teachers and their students. So you can go to the Pope's Prayer Network and pray along with the Pope for mental health concerns. And so those would be the two main things I would say at this point. I mean, there's a whole list of things I suppose you could do, but I would focus on that, the Pope's Prayer Network and our website. And everything, by the way, everything on our website's free. It's not like we're going to be soliciting you for donations and making you pay for stuff. It's all free and readily available to try to get this ministry started in your parish.
I love that. Well, Deacon Ed, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about this heavy topic. It's nice to know that the support is there and that there are a lot more people willing to talk about this, so we don't feel so isolated sitting in the pews.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Rachel. Thank you for talking about your own struggles, mental health challenges, particularly with postpartum. Yeah, it's important we just talk about this and let the light of Christ shine into our lives and into our communities, because Christ wants to be with us in these struggles. Christ certainly doesn't have any stigma. Christ is the greatest psychologist that ever existed. He understands what we're struggling with, and he wants to be with us in the midst of all of these struggles and provide us the support. And as Pope Francis said in his film on depression, is that he offers a light that opens up the life. So if you shine the light of Christ into the dark, whether often corners where we don't allow the light of Christ to come in, if we allow Christ's life to come into the midst of these mental health struggles, his light will open us up to that life that he so much wants to give to us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rachel.